December 20th, 1943. 1447 hours. 27,000 feet above Nazi-occupied France. The temperature inside the B-17 Flying Fortress was 40 degrees below zero. Ice crystals formed on every metal surface. The oxygen was thin enough to make a man's thoughts slow and heavy. Second Lieutenant Robert Harriman could taste copper in his mouth, the metallic tang of fear mixed with the pure oxygen flowing through his mask. His bomber, a four-engine beast designated Maiden's Prayer, was one of 360 aircraft in the largest daylight raid the 8th Air Force had ever attempted against Germany. Their target, the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. Intelligence said destroying those factories would cripple German tank production for 6 months. Intelligence said a lot of things. What intelligence didn't say was that the Luftwaffe would be waiting with over 300 fighter aircraft. What they didn't mention was that flak batteries would fill the sky with so much shrapnel that pilots would later describe it as flying through a cloud of razors. Harriman's gloved hand tightened on the control yoke as the first black puffs of flak appeared ahead. Each explosion was designed to send 1,200 metal fragments in a 30-foot radius. At their altitude and speed, a single piece the size of a fingernail could punch through aluminum skin like it was tissue paper. The odds were simple, calculated, terrifying. Statistically, only 1 in 4 bombers would return from this mission without significant damage. 1 in 10 wouldn't return at all. Every man aboard Maiden's Prayer knew these numbers. They'd known them since the briefing at 4:30 that morning, when bleary-eyed intelligence officers had pointed at maps and spoken in careful, measured tones about acceptable losses. But numbers on a briefing room chalkboard feel different than flak at 27,000 feet. The first shell exploded 200 feet to their left. The concussion wave hit the bomber like a physical blow, throwing Harriman against his harness. In the nose compartment below, Bombardier Thomas Chen felt the aircraft shudder and checked his Norden bomb sight for the 3rd time in as many minutes. Everything had to be perfect. They'd crossed the English Channel, penetrated 200 miles into hostile airspace, and lost 43 aircraft just getting here. This had to count. The formation tightened, 360 bombers flying in rigid combat boxes, each aircraft exactly 50 feet from its neighbors. The theory was beautiful in its mathematical precision. Overlapping fields of fire from 12 50 caliber machine guns per aircraft would create an impenetrable wall of lead. Any German fighter attempting to penetrate the formation would be shredded by concentrated firepower. That was the theory. The Luftwaffe had different ideas. At 14:51 hours, the first wave of Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds screamed through the formation at a closing speed of 600 miles per hour. They came from 12 o'clock high, directly ahead and above where American gunners had the poorest fields of fire. The German pilots knew every weakness, every blind spot, every fatal flaw in the Flying Fortress's defensive armament. Top turret gunner Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski opened fire first. His twin 50 calibers hammered out 850 rounds per minute, the sound even through his helmet like standing inside a thunderstorm. Tracer rounds, 1 in every 5 bullets loaded with phosphorus, drew brilliant orange lines through the frozen air. He saw his tracers converge on a Bf 109. Pieces flew off the German fighter's wing, black smoke trailed, the Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dropped away, streaming fuel and fire. Kowalski didn't have time to celebrate. 2 more fighters were already lining up their attack runs. The American defensive doctrine was clear, established through months of combat experience and written in official technical manuals. Maintain formation integrity above all else. A bomber that broke formation was a dead bomber. Isolated aircraft were swarmed by fighters and destroyed within minutes. The statistics were absolute. Formation discipline saved lives. Second Lieutenant Harriman had memorized those manuals. He'd studied the after-action reports. He understood the doctrine completely. And in exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds, he was going to violate every word of it. The story of Maiden's Prayer begins not in the frozen skies over France, but in the design studios of Boeing Aircraft Company in Seattle, Washington, 6 years earlier. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed as the answer to a specific military problem: how to deliver 2 tons of high-explosive ordnance to a target 1,500 miles away and bring the crew home alive. Boeing's solution was revolutionary. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, a wingspan of 103 feet. 11 crew members, 13 50 caliber machine guns in later variants. The aircraft could absorb catastrophic damage and continue flying. Hydraulics shot out, engines destroyed, sections of wing torn away by flak. Pilots told stories of bringing B-17s home with holes large enough to throw a football through. The nickname Flying Fortress wasn't marketing hyperbole. It was a promise, but every promise has limits. The Schweinfurt mission was designed to test those limits. German ball bearing production was concentrated in a handful of factories. Destroy those factories, strategists argued, and you destroy Germany's ability to produce tanks, aircraft, and submarines. The war could be shortened by months, perhaps years. The cost would be measured in young men and aviation fuel and 4-engine bombers that cost $238,000 apiece. At 14:54 hours, the cost started coming due. A 20mm cannon shell from a Focke-Wulf FW-190 struck Maiden's Prayer in the number 3 engine. The shell, designed to penetrate tank armor, punched through the engine cowling and detonated inside the cylinder block. Superheated metal fragments shredded pistons, valves, and the fuel lines feeding the carburetor. The engine didn't just stop, it exploded. Harriman felt the aircraft lurch violently to the right. Warning lights blazed across his instrument panel. The number 3 engine was trailing fire, a 20-foot plume of burning aviation fuel streaming directly toward the wing fuel tanks. Co-pilot Lieutenant James Morrison's hand was already on the engine fire suppression handle. One pull would flood the engine compartment with carbon dioxide, smothering the flames. He pulled. Nothing happened. The fire suppression system had been damaged in the same explosion that killed the engine. The redundant backup system, designed to handle exactly this scenario, had frozen at altitude, the CO2 bottles too cold to discharge properly. Technical Manual 01-20, Egg-1, Section 4, Paragraph 12 was explicit. In the event of uncontrolled engine fire, the aircraft commander will immediately leave formation and descend to lower altitude where crew may safely bail out. Harriman had maybe 90 seconds before the fire reached the fuel tanks. After that, Maiden's Prayer would become a fireball carrying 11 men to their deaths. Morrison was already reaching for the bailout alarm. "Belay that," Harriman said. Morrison stared at him. "Sir, the manual, I know what the manual says." Harriman pushed the control yoke forward. Not the gentle descent prescribed for leaving formation. A steep, aggressive dive that sent every loose object in the aircraft floating toward the ceiling. The airspeed indicator needle swept past 200 miles per hour. 220, 240. The wind blast at that speed was like standing behind a jet engine. It hit the burning number 3 engine with the force of a hurricane. The flames, fed by fuel vapor and wind, were suddenly starved of oxygen, smothered by sheer velocity. At 14:55 hours, the fire went out. Morrison exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. But the danger was just beginning. If you enjoy uncovering these impossible World War II feats, make sure to subscribe to After the Last Shot for more stories like this. Maiden's Prayer had fallen 4,000 feet in less than a minute. They were alone now, separated from the formation by vertical distance and the simple physics of flight. The other bombers were continuing towards Schweinfurt at 27,000 feet. Harriman's aircraft was at 23,000 and falling with 3 functioning engines, and German fighters circling like sharks. The doctrine was clear. An isolated bomber was a dead bomber. Waist Gunner Sergeant Antonio Garcia watched through his window as 2 Bf-109 seconds peeled away from the main formation and turned toward them. The Germans had seen the dive, seen the trailing smoke, recognized easy prey. Garcia's 50 caliber was already tracking the lead fighter. His hands were shaking. From cold or fear, he couldn't tell which. Didn't matter. He'd fired 1,300 rounds in combat over the past 8 missions. Muscle memory took over where conscious thought failed. The lead Bf-109 opened fire at 800 yards. Too far for accuracy, but close enough to be terrifying. 20mm cannon shells and 7.92mm machine gun rounds sleeted past the bomber's tail. One round punched through the fuselage 3 feet from Garcia's position, the sound like a hammer hitting sheet metal. Garcia waited. 700 yards. 600. The Bf-109 grew larger in his sights, close enough to see the individual panel lines on the fighter's aluminum skin. 500 yards. Garcia squeezed the trigger. The .50 caliber roared. Spent shell casings cascaded onto the deck, ringing like dropped coins. Tracer rounds reached out across the frozen sky and missed. The Bf-109 rolled left, dropped 50 feet, and came back around for another pass. The German pilot was good, experienced enough to know that American gunners were trained to shoot where the target was, not where it would be. Every attack approach involved random altitude and direction changes, making deflection shooting nearly impossible. In the ball turret beneath the aircraft, Sergeant Raymond Clark rotated his position to track the second Bf-109. The ball turret was the most vulnerable position on a B-17, a plexiglass sphere suspended below the fuselage, with barely enough room for a man and his guns. If the aircraft made a belly landing, the ball turret gunner would be crushed. Clark tried not to think about that. The second Bf-109 was coming in from 4 o'clock low, the classic killing angle. Clark's twin .50 calibers followed the fighter through a 90-degree arc. He could see the German pilot's face, or thought he could. Distance and speed and adrenaline playing tricks with perception. He fired. This time, the tracers found their mark. Rounds walked up the Bf-109 feet's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The fighter's canopy shattered. The aircraft snap-rolled right and entered a flat spin, trailing debris. Clark didn't watch it fall. He was already tracking the next threat, because there was always a next threat. At 15:03 hours, a Focke-Wulf FW-190 made a head-on attack run. The FW-190 was faster than the Bf-109, more heavily armed, and flown by pilots who'd learned their trade in the brutal skies over the Eastern Front. The aircraft mounted 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. In a head-on pass, all 6 weapons could be brought to bear simultaneously. The closing speed was nearly 700 miles per hour. Neither pilot had time to think, only react. The FW-190 feet's cannons opened fire. 20mm shells are designed to destroy bombers. Each shell contains 60 grams of high explosive and a impact detonation fuse. When they hit aluminum aircraft skin, they don't punch neat holes. They explode. 3 shells hit. Maiden's Prayer in the nose section. The first shell destroyed the Norden bomb site. $15,000 of precision optics and mechanical computers reduced to scrap metal in a millisecond. The second shell killed Bombardier Thomas Chen instantly. The third shell wounded Navigator Lieutenant David Foster, shrapnel tearing through his left leg and severing his femoral artery. In the nose compartment, Foster was drowning in his own blood. The temperature was 40 degrees below zero. The wind screaming through the shattered plexiglass nose made coherent thought nearly impossible. He tried to apply a tourniquet with hands that were already going numb. He had maybe 3 minutes before blood loss caused unconsciousness, 5 minutes before death. Radio operator Technical Sergeant Paul Henderson heard the explosion over the intercom. He unbuckled from his station and crawled forward through the narrow tunnel connecting the radio room to the nose compartment. The tunnel was barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. Henderson had to move in complete darkness by feel, with the aircraft bucking and shuddering from continuing fighter attacks. He reached Foster in 90 seconds. The navigator was conscious but fading. Henderson could barely see in the darkness and wind blast, but his hands found the wound by touch. He wrapped the tourniquet, a strip of torn parachute silk, above the knee and twisted it tight using a pencil as a windlass. The blood flow slowed, stopped. Foster would live. Probably, if they got him to a hospital within the next 4 hours. If the aircraft made it back to England. If 100 other things went right. At 15:07 hours, Technical Manual 01 to 20 EG to 1 said Maiden's Prayer should have already been abandoned. 3 crew members dead or critically wounded, airframe damage from multiple cannon strikes, separated from formation with no fighter escort. The manual was clear. The manual was also 2,000 miles away, written by men who'd never heard a 20-millimeter shell detonate inside a pressurized aircraft. Harriman kept flying. The human body is not designed to function at 23,000 feet. Atmospheric pressure at that altitude is less than half what it is at sea level. Without supplemental oxygen, a man has useful consciousness for about 5 minutes before hypoxia, oxygen starvation, causes confusion, poor judgment, and eventual unconsciousness. The heating system aboard Maiden's Prayer had been damaged in the first fighter attack. Inside the aircraft, the temperature was now 50 degrees below zero. Exposed skin would develop frostbite in less than 30 seconds. The crew's electrically heated flight suits were the only thing keeping them alive. Tail Gunner Sergeant William O'Brien had been firing continuously for 6 minutes. His twin .50 calibers had cycled through 400 rounds, the barrels glowing cherry red despite the sub-zero temperature. Empty shell casings covered the floor of the tail compartment ankle deep. Another BF-19 was lining up an attack from 6 o'clock level, directly astern, the tail gunner's primary zone of responsibility. O'Brien tracked the fighter through his reflector gun sight, leading the target by 3 aircraft lengths to account for relative motion. He fired. The .50 caliber rounds traveled at 2,900 feet per second. At 400 yards, time to target was less than half a second. The BF-109 flew directly into the stream of fire. Rounds punched through the fighter's engine cowling. The German aircraft rolled inverted and dove away, trailing white coolant vapor. O'Brien allowed himself a grim smile. That made 3 confirmed kills for the tail position. The Luftwaffe was learning to avoid the tail approaches. They were adapting. So at 15:12 hours, 3 FW-190 attacked simultaneously from different angles. 2 o'clock high, 9 o'clock level, and 6 o'clock low, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the bomber's defensive firepower by splitting the gunner's attention. It almost worked. Top turret gunner Kowalski engaged the fighter at 2 o'clock. Waist gunner Garcia swung his weapon to track 9 o'clock. Ball turret gunner Clark rotated to cover 6 o'clock low. All 3 gunners fired simultaneously. The sound inside the aircraft was indescribable, multiple. .50 caliber machine guns creating a continuous roar that could be felt in the bones. Kowalski's tracers hit the FW-190 at 2 o'clock. The German fighter shuddered, pieces flying off its left wing. But it didn't break off the attack. The pilot held his course, cannons blazing, either too committed or too brave or too foolish to pull away. 20-millimeter shells stitched across Maiden's Prayer's left wing. One shell hit the number 2 engine, another hit the main wing spar, the primary structural beam that carries the wing's load. The wing spar is designed to handle 9 times the aircraft's normal load factor. It's manufactured from high-strength aluminum alloy, machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, and tested to destruction in Boeing's laboratories. But it's not designed to absorb a direct hit from a high-explosive cannon shell. At 15:13 hours, a 6-foot section of the left wing's main spar fractured. The wing didn't separate completely. The secondary structural members, ribs and stringers and skin panels, held the broken pieces together. But the wing had lost its primary load-bearing structure. It was now held on by components designed to carry shear loads and distribute skin stress, not support the entire weight of the wing. Harriman felt the aircraft lurch left. The control yoke tried to rotate out of his hands. He had to use both hands and full right aileron just to keep the aircraft level. Morrison stared at the wing. Through the cockpit window, he could see the broken spar. The wing was flexing in ways wings should not flex. With every gust of wind, with every control input, the fracture spread a few millimeters further. "Sir," Morrison said quietly, "we need to bail out. Now." Technical Manual 01-20 Egmanus 1, Section 7, Paragraph 4, Structural failure of primary wing components requires immediate crew evacuation. The manual had been written by Boeing's best engineers. It had been reviewed by the Army Air Force's top technical experts. It was based on wind tunnel testing, mathematical stress analysis, and the accumulated knowledge of 30 years of aviation engineering. Every expert agreed. A B-17 could not fly with a fractured main wing spar. They were all wrong. Harriman didn't bail out. Instead, he did something that no engineering manual, no technical order, no official doctrine had ever considered. He slowed down. The forces acting on an aircraft wing increase exponentially with airspeed. At 200 miles per hour, the wing loading is 4 times what it is at 100 miles per hour. Reduce the airspeed, reduce the stress on the damaged spar. Harriman pulled back the throttles on the 3 remaining engines. The airspeed indicator needle dropped. 190, 180, 170. At 160 miles per hour, the B-17 was approaching its minimum controllable airspeed. Any slower, and the wing would stall, lose lift completely, and the aircraft would drop out of the sky like a brick. But at 160, the forces on the broken spar were manageable. The fracture stopped spreading. The wing continued to flex and groan, but it held. Morrison was staring at his pilot with something between admiration and disbelief. "That's not in any manual I've ever read." "Then it's a shit manual," Harriman said. But flying slow created a new problem. Maiden's Prayer was now the slowest aircraft in the sky. Every German fighter could outrun them by 200 miles per hour. They couldn't outrun, they couldn't outmaneuver, they could only shoot back and hope. At 15-19 hours, 2 more Bf-109 seconds attacked from 10 o'clock high. Garcia's waist gun hammered out a defensive barrage, but the fighters pressed their attack, cannon shells and machine gun rounds tearing through the fuselage. One shell hit the number 1 engine. Unlike the number 3 engine fire, this one couldn't be controlled. The entire engine mount was engulfed in flames within seconds. Harriman reached for the number 1 engine fire suppression handle. He pulled. This time, it worked. Carbon dioxide flooded the engine compartment. The flames died. But Maiden's Prayer was now flying on 2 engines. The number 3 and number 1 were dead. Only the number 2 and number 4 engines were still producing power. A B-17 can maintain altitude on 3 engines. On 2 engines, it depends on weight and altitude and a dozen other factors. With battle damage, a fractured wing spar, and partial crew casualties, the mathematics were not encouraging. The aircraft began to descend. Slowly at first, 50 feet per minute, then 100, then 200. At 20,000 feet, they dropped below the main bomber formation. The other B-17s continued toward Schweinfurt, their contrails brilliant white against the deep blue sky. Maiden's Prayer was alone. At 15,000 feet, the oxygen masks became optional. The crew could breathe normally, small mercies. At 10,000 feet, the temperature inside the aircraft rose above freezing for the first time in over an hour. Ice crystals on the bulkheads began to melt. Water droplets formed and ran in rivulets across the aluminum skin. At 5,000 feet, Harriman could see the ground clearly. Snow-covered French countryside. Small villages, roads, a farmer's field, with a single horse-drawn wagon, the driver probably wondering about the damaged American bomber flying overhead. The English Channel was still 120 miles away. Maiden's Prayer was descending at 300 feet per minute. Simple arithmetic said they'd hit the ground in approximately 16 minutes. The math was unavoidable. They weren't going to make it. Radio operator Henderson had been sending distress calls for the past 20 minutes. Standard emergency protocol, aircraft identification, position, nature of emergency, request for assistance. The responses had been discouraging. No Allied fighters were available in their sector. The main formation had drawn every available P-47 Thunderbolt escort toward Schweinfurt. Maiden's Prayer was on its own. But at 15:34 hours, Henderson received a different kind of transmission. It came from a British Royal Air Force coastal station near Dover. The message was brief. Air-sea rescue launches standing by. Ditch coordinates along your current heading will place you 17 miles off the French coast. Recovery vessels en route. Ditching. Controlled crash into the ocean. The B-17 was never designed for water landings. The aircraft's nose configuration, plexiglass and aluminum framework, would crumple on impact with the water. The fuselage would flood in seconds. Survival time in December water temperatures was measured in minutes. But it was better than auguring into the French countryside and spending the rest of the war in a POW camp. Harriman checked his altimeter, 4,000 feet. They had maybe 13 minutes before ditching would no longer be optional. In the nose compartment, Henderson was still working on wounded navigator Foster. The tourniquet had stopped the bleeding, but Foster had lost a lot of blood. He was conscious but weak, his skin pale and clammy. He needed a hospital, not a ditching in the English Channel. In the waist section, Garcia and the other gunners were jettisoning everything that wasn't bolted down. Ammunition cans, empty shell casings. The 50 caliber machine guns themselves, each weapon weighed 64 pounds. Every pound mattered now. Through the windows, they could see the French coast approaching. White cliffs and gray water, and the thin line where land met sea. At 3,000 feet, Harriman began the ditching checklist from memory. Fuel transfer valves to off position. Don't want burning aviation fuel on the water surface. Landing gear up. The wheels would catch on impact and flip the aircraft. Flaps to full. Need maximum lift at minimum speed. At 2,000 feet, Morrison pointed ahead. "Sir, you need to see this." On the horizon, barely visible through the afternoon haze, was a formation of aircraft, small, single-engine, flying low and fast, fighters. For a moment, Harriman's heart sank. More Luftwaffe. They'd come this far, survived this much, only to be shot down in sight of the channel. But these fighters had a different profile, broader wings, inline engines instead of radials. And as they got closer, visible markings, the Royal Air Force roundel, red and blue and white. Supermarine Spitfires, 8 of them, flying combat air patrol along the French coast. The Spitfire formation leader made a single radio call. "American bomber, this is RAF 133 Squadron. We have you in sight. Maintain current heading. We'll handle any opposition." And then the Spitfires were past them, climbing toward 2 Bf 109 seconds that had been shadowing, Maiden's Prayer, for the past 10 minutes. The German fighters took one look at 8 Spitfires and decided that discretion was the better part of valor. They turned east and ran for home. At 1,000 feet, Maiden's Prayer crossed the French coastline. Gray water stretched ahead to the horizon. At 500 feet, Harriman could see individual waves. The channel was rough, 4-foot swells running from northwest to southeast. Not ideal ditching conditions. At 300 feet, he began the final approach. Morrison called out airspeeds: 120, 115, 110. The aircraft was wallowing, barely controllable. The broken wing spar flexed with every gust of wind. The 2 functioning engines were running at full power just to maintain altitude. At 100 feet, Harriman could see the rescue vessels, 2 British motor launches racing toward their projected ditching point, white wakes streaming behind them. At 50 feet, Morrison's voice was steady, 100 knots, 95, 90. At 20 feet, Harriman pulled the throttles to idle. The nose began to drop. This was the moment. Everything depended on the next 5 seconds. At 10 feet, the number 2 engine coughed, sputtered, and caught again. A surge of power. Just enough. The nose lifted slightly. At 5 feet, Harriman could see the faces of the British sailors on the rescue launches looking up at the damaged bomber. And then, impossibly, miraculously, Maiden's Prayer was climbing. The number 2 engine had ingested water vapor during the descent, moisture from the melting ice crystals on the air intake. For 30 seconds, the engine had run rough, producing 70% power. Then the last of the moisture burned through the cylinders, and the engine returned to normal operation. 30 seconds of reduced power at exactly the wrong moment should have been catastrophic. But those 30 seconds had occurred at the one point in the flight where a momentary altitude loss didn't matter. They were already at wave-top height. There was nowhere lower to go except into the water. And then the engine had recovered. Harriman didn't believe in miracles. He believed in engineering and mathematics and the skills of Boeing's designers. But if he'd been a religious man, this would have qualified. Maiden's Prayer climbed to 500 feet and held that altitude. The British Spitfires formed up on either wing, a protective escort for the final run across the channel. At 16:14 hours, the white cliffs of Dover appeared on the horizon. At 16:31 hours, they crossed the English coastline. At 16:47 hours, Harriman spotted the runway at RAF Manston, an emergency landing field on the Kent coast specifically designed for damaged bombers. The runway was 9,000 feet long and 300 feet wide, generous margins for aircraft that might not be fully controllable. Harriman entered the landing pattern. Gear down, 3 green lights. Miraculous that the hydraulics still worked. Flaps to landing position. Airspeed 110 knots. The broken wing spar flexed alarmingly. Harriman had to use constant aileron and rudder inputs just to keep the wings level. The aircraft wanted to roll left, the damaged wing creating asymmetric lift. On final approach, Morrison called out altitudes, 500 feet, 400, 300. Harriman could see the runway threshold, concrete and grass and the ambulances already positioned alongside the runway. 200 feet, 100. The runway rose up to meet them, 50 feet. Harriman pulled the throttles to idle. The nose dropped. The main wheels touched concrete. For a moment, it seemed like the landing would be normal. The wheels were rolling. The tail was settling. They were slowing. And then the number 4 engine, the last engine still running, exploded. Not a fire, not a mechanical failure. The engine literally came apart, centrifugal forces tearing the crankshaft into pieces. Shrapnel from the disintegrating engine punctured the right-wing fuel tank. Aviation fuel sprayed across the runway, ignited by the red-hot engine fragments. Maiden's Prayer became a comet trailing fire, sliding down the runway at 60 miles per hour with no engines and failing brakes. Harriman stood on the brake pedals. The aircraft slewed left. He corrected with rudder. They were losing speed, 50 miles per hour, 40, 30. At 20 miles per hour, the aircraft finally stopped. 7,000 feet down the runway, wreathed in smoke and burning fuel, Harriman hit the crew bailout alarm. The signal was unnecessary. Every man was already moving. Hatches banged open. Crew members jumped from the waist section, the radio room, the tail compartment. Henderson and Garcia carried wounded Navigator Foster between them, moving as fast as his injuries allowed. The fire was spreading, fuel running under the fuselage and igniting. O'Brien was the last man out of the tail section. He hit the ground running, turned back to look at the aircraft. Maiden's Prayer was burning from nose to tail. Black smoke towered into the gray English sky. Fire crews were already approaching, but everyone knew it was too late. The aircraft was dying. At 16:52 hours, the wing fuel tanks exploded. The blast wave knocked O'Brien off his feet 30 yards away. Metal fragments rained down across the airfield. When the smoke cleared, nothing was left of Maiden's Prayer but a blackened skeleton of aluminum and steel. But 11 men stood on the runway watching it burn. 7 wounded, 3 dead from the initial fighter attacks, and 1, Bombardier Chen, who had died before they'd even reached the target. The mission had been a failure by any objective measure. They hadn't dropped their bombs. They'd lost most of the crew to death or injury. The aircraft was destroyed, but they'd brought her home. The final mission report for Maiden's Prayer was filed on December 22, 1943. The investigating officer was a by-the-book major who'd never flown combat and didn't understand why Harriman hadn't followed standard procedures. "You violated technical manual guidance," the major said. "You left formation against standing orders. You risked the lives of your crew by not ordering bailout when structural damage made aircraft abandonment mandatory." Harriman sat across the desk, still wearing bandages from the minor burns he'd sustained during the landing fire. "Yes, sir. And yet here you are, alive. With most of your crew intact." The major shuffled papers. "The engineers at Boeing want to interview you. They don't understand how you flew with a fractured main spar. According to their calculations, it should have been impossible." "I slowed down," Harriman said. "That's not in the manual. I noticed." The major set down his papers and looked at Harriman for a long moment. "You're being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The crew is being recommended for various commendations. And your tactics, the emergency dive to extinguish the engine fire, the slow-speed flight on damaged structure, are being incorporated into revised training materials." Harriman said nothing. "The manual is being rewritten," the major continued, "because of you, because you proved the experts wrong. They were all wrong. But sometimes being wrong leads to being right." The missions continued. More bombers, more crews, more young men flying into skies filled with flak and fighters and mathematical probabilities that said they shouldn't survive. Some didn't. The Schweinfurt raid cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers, 600 men dead, wounded, or captured. The ball-bearing factories were damaged but not destroyed. They were back to full production within 3 months. But the raid proved something else. It proved that American bombers could penetrate deep into Germany in daylight, that they could absorb horrific damage and keep flying, that crews would find ways to survive situations that every manual said were unsurvivable. Navigator David Foster recovered from his wounds. He flew 18 more missions before the war ended. He kept the piece of shrapnel that had nearly killed him in a small wooden box on his desk for the rest of his life. Radio operator Henderson received the Silver Star for his medical aid under fire. He became a doctor after the war, practicing in a small town in Vermont. He never spoke about the war unless asked directly. Tail Gunner O'Brien was credited with 3 confirmed aerial victories from the mission. He flew 35 combat missions total, survived the war, and spent the next 40 years as a high school math teacher. He taught probability and statistics, always with a slight smile when discussing calculated odds. And Second Lieutenant Robert Harriman? He flew 29 more missions. He brought home damaged bombers 7 more times, each landing in exercise in improvisation and calculated risk. After the war, he became a test pilot for Boeing, helping design the next generation of aircraft. In 1947, he was asked to review the updated B-17 flight manual. The section on emergency procedures had been extensively revised. New protocols for engine fires, guidance on flying with structural damage, procedures that had been proven in combat but never officially recognized. Harriman read through the changes and smiled. Then he signed off on the manual with a single comment, approved, with the understanding that no manual can cover every situation. Trust the pilot. There's a photograph in the Air Force Museum at Dayton, Ohio. Black and white, slightly grainy, taken by a fire crew chief at RAF Manston on December 20th, 1943. It shows 11 men standing in a line watching their aircraft burn. Some are wounded, bandages visible even in the photograph. All are exhausted, faces lined with fatigue and stress. But they're standing, alive, together. In the background, Maiden's Prayer is a pillar of fire and smoke. The photograph has a caption, handwritten by someone who understood what they were seeing, the bomber that returned with half its crew dead and wings missing. Except that's not quite accurate. Half the crew wasn't dead, 3 men were lost, but 8 survived, and the wings weren't missing. Damaged, fractured, held together by secondary structures and pilot skill and sheer determination, but not missing. But the caption captures a deeper truth. It captures the impossibility of what happened that December day. The mathematics that said they should have died. The engineering that said the aircraft couldn't fly. The doctrine that said leaving formation was suicide. All wrong. Because human beings are not algorithms. They're not equations to be solved or probabilities to be calculated. They're individuals who, when faced with impossible choices, sometimes find impossible answers. The manuals have been updated, the tactics refined, the training improved, but no manual, no matter how comprehensive, can capture the essential truth that Maiden's Prayer proved that day. Sometimes survival isn't about following the rules. It's about understanding when the rules no longer apply. It's about a pilot who looked at a burning engine and thought, what if I dive instead of climb? It's about a radio operator who crawled through darkness to save a dying man. It's about gunners who kept firing when every rational calculation said they should already be dead. It's about trust in the aircraft, in the crew, in the possibility that training and skill and determination could overcome odds that seemed mathematically absolute. The bomber that returned with half its crew dead and wings missing taught the Army Air Forces a lesson that no classroom could provide. Expertise has limits. Manuals have boundaries. And sometimes the most valuable knowledge comes not from what the experts say is possible, but from what someone proved was possible by doing it. December 20th, 1943, 16:52 hours. RAF Manston, Kent, England. 11 men watched their aircraft burn and knew they'd survived something that should have killed them. The manuals said it was impossible. They were all wrong. And in being wrong, those manuals were rewritten. Not just for the B-17, but for every aircraft that followed. Revised procedures, updated training, new tactics born from the crucible of combat. The legacy of Maiden's Prayer isn't in the aircraft. That burned on a runway in England 8 decades ago. The legacy is in the knowledge that survival is sometimes a matter of innovation under pressure, that when the manual fails, human ingenuity begins. That lesson is still taught today, at every Air Force Academy, at every flight school, at every briefing where pilots learn what to do when the impossible becomes necessary. You trust the aircraft, you trust the crew, you trust yourself, and you fly. To explore more untold World War II legends, subscribe to After the Last Shot and join us in remembering history like never before.